Hello and welcome to Module 4 of the Agreement for Sale Cash Cow Formula. I am your host, Sherilyn Milsom, and today we are covering management and our exit. As usual, some cash cow ground rules. Make note of all of your questions and bring them to the Q&A session. And you can email questions to sherilyn@sherilyn.ca. Go to your membership portal for documents and replays and transcripts and all that wonderful stuff. And of course, protect all documents and refrain from sharing. And be sure to do your homework. On today's menu, we are discussing the multiple hold and exit strategies for agreement for sale properties. Those include renting, refinancing, and selling, or fix and refinance, then rent or rent to own, fix and flip, sell immediately, assign, or rent to own. And first, we are covering management of our agreement for sale property and the deal itself. The first step in management is to change the address for all documents. So that applies to any emailed documents or digital documents, as well as mailing addresses, because we want all of these to go to us as the beneficial owner instead of to the seller of the agreement for sale property, because he is still on mortgage and title. So by default, he's going to get everything unless we change it. So for mortgage renewal, of course, we want that to come to us. So that applies with mortgage documents, mortgage statement. We want all of those documents to come to us. So we do need to change the address for mailing at the bank. And if they don't go to us, if they go to the property, which is the address that will likely still be on file, then your tenant may not know what that is. And of course, it's going to be in the name of the titled owner. So chances are, if your tenant gets a document sent to the address with that previous owner's name on it, he's just going to mark return to sender and send it back. And you are going to have trouble getting these documents. So it's very important to change the address. Your address for insurance, of course, if you have the policy in your name, then the documents will come to you. But if for some reason you're not able to get a policy in your name and it stays in the seller's name, you'll want to have your address as the address for service. Municipal utilities, same thing. Often municipal utilities stay in the titled owner's name, and often they can be emailed. So that's how we have ours set up with the one property that we have where the municipality stays on the water utilities. So that's a great thing to do, is have it emailed to you. And taxes, a lot of municipalities are also doing taxes with online access. So either way, digital access or email or mailing address, you do need to switch it to make sure you get all the documents you need for effective management. Effective management also involves a calendar where you can set reminders. And these are for some very important dates. When does your underlying mortgage mature? You want to make sure that you have a few months' notice so you can re-examine what you're doing with the property and prepare for any renewals or whatever you may need to do. When does the agreement for sale mature? Now, usually this matches with the underlying mortgage, but not always, because you may have chosen a 5-year variable mortgage, but your intention with the agreement for sale was for, say, a 2-year agreement for sale. So your agreement for sale document may have only been renewed for 2 years rather than 5. So sometimes they are different. The tenant's lease term is very important, especially if it's a rent to own tenant. Now, if you have a regular tenant and you're either selling or refinancing, then it's not such a big deal, or renewing. But if you have a rent to own tenant where they need to get their own financing in place, then you need to keep track of that, make sure that they have a couple of months to get their financing approved before your underlying mortgage comes due, because otherwise, you're going to have a bit of a time crunch with everything happening at the same time. So again, your tenant is going to need probably at least 2 months to get their financing approved. So make sure that you have that date set up at least 2 months before your underlying mortgage and agreement for sale mature. if you do need to consider renewal, you need to review your exit plan for that property a couple of months before the maturity of the mortgage and the agreement for sale. So if you were planning to sell, is it going to be a good time to sell? If you were planning to refinance, is that even possible? So you need to review that plan in order to know whether you can continue with that exit or potentially need to renew. And if you can't execute your exit or your refinance, of course, that underlying mortgage and the agreement for sale will both need to be renewed. And as per the contracts that we use, the seller must grant you the first renewal as per your wishes for what the mortgage renewal will be if the lender offers a renewal. In a very rare case, the lender will not offer a renewal. We did have that. It wasn't an agreement for sale property. A seller had approached us trying to sell his property because the lender was not going to be doing any rental mortgages whatsoever anymore. They were completely getting out of it. It was a smaller lender. And so they were not offering a renewal for this property. And unfortunately, this person could not qualify to refinance with someone else. So he desperately needed to get rid of his property. Now, your renewal agreement should be sent to the seller prior to maturity, so they have a chance to review it, and also because we're going to need them to send us the mortgage renewal offer. And if there is a little to no unpaid seller's equity, there's usually not an issue with getting a renewal done, even if it's a subsequent renewal, because they're not waiting for any cash portion of equity to be paid out, and they don't have a hunk of money sitting there that they're going to be using towards buying another property. So, and chances are, if there was a little equity, they probably haven't saved up any money to buy another property and don't need their name off this mortgage. It'll often take a couple of renewals before that happens if they've been in dire straits with this property when they sold it. And in that case, the renewal is usually incredibly simple with no changes. Now, if there is substantial unpaid seller's equity, the cash portion, then you may need to renegotiate, because think about it. Let's say they had a term of 4 years with you, and yes, of course, you gave them a slightly better price for the privilege of them leaving the money in and you enjoying the mortgage pay down on that. But then after that 4 years, they were expecting that balloon payment of 50 or 70 or $100,000. Now you're requesting the renewal, which they are obligated to accept, but they're not getting any more money. So you may need to renegotiate some terms to make it more fair for them, because again, they do have to agree to the renewal, but it's not really fair to expect them to not get any benefit from the renewal. So our options for renewal are to have no changes. Again, usually that's with little to no unpaid seller's cash portion of equity. But in some cases, the seller feels like he got a good enough deal to start with. He doesn't need the money right now, and he's happy to just let it sit the way it is. So it could be either way. In some cases, you will pay a portion of their equity now of that cash owing, and it could be a payment plan for smaller chunks of equity over time. And sometimes you may give a bonus, especially if they're leaving a huge portion of their equity still in the property, that you are still getting the benefit of the mortgage pay down and you're not cash out of pocket to pay them some of their equity. So that's when I would absolutely be willing to pay a bonus. And in fact, I have done all of these, and strangely enough, all of them we've done on one property. So we'll talk a bit about that. Now, with that unpaid seller's equity, with the cash portion, the mortgage paydown rate stays the same, because even if we're renewing the mortgage, the amortization length stays the same. So your payment's going to change with a mortgage renewal, but the rate of paydown of principal is going to stay the same. But when we're paying some of that cash portion to the seller out of our pockets, then we're really decreasing our return on investment because we're investing more money. This is especially important if you have a joint venture partner involved. And a good example of this would be, let's say you got little to no money down, but you did a big renovation on the property. So you brought in a joint venture partner to cover those costs. Now you're asking for more money to pay out the seller for that renewal. And especially if the joint venture partner is expected to pay out that money, they're going to have a reduction in their return on investment. So it's just something to consider. And that's why we reward our sellers at title transfer for leaving their equity in the property and not expecting a payout until title transfers. Then we give them that bonus as a reward for them to leave their money in. And of course, any repayment of that cash portion or any bonus that we're paying is noted in the renewal agreement. Here is a blank sample of the renewal agreement, and it is very simple. It's just a page long. And the dates and addresses, whereas the parties entered into an agreement for sale dated on the date for the real property located at address, the term of which matures date. The parties desire to extend the term of the agreement for sale hereinafter set forth. Now, this section is for the details of the financing and, of course, the balance owing, aka unpaid seller's equity or principal amount, including mortgage balances, is going to be now updated to today's balance of mortgage plus unpaid cash portion owing. And then the details of the unpaid seller's equity are an amount equal to the existing mortgage principal amount. Buyer will make payments at the same interest rate and calculated exactly the same as in the existing mortgage. So that is the same term as in the initial original agreement for sale. And we don't really provide any details of the financing except for the term because we don't yet have the mortgage renewal offer. So we may indicate which term we require, but you could also leave that blank to be decided later based on what the mortgage offer is, because sometimes they have an irresistible rate for, let's say, a 3-year mortgage that you want to take advantage of. So you could put the term in there, but then the next line stipulates that the seller will provide the buyer a copy of the lender's renewal offer. The buyer shall then choose a renewal term if not already stipulated above in item I. If the term is stipulated, great, and if not, then it will be chosen at the renewal. And payment frequency and amortization, and advise the seller in writing. The seller will forthwith renew the mortgage as per the terms stipulated by the buyer unless already agreed herein. So as I say, it can be done either way. And at this point, we have not yet received the offer of renewal from the bank. Now, this is the important part. The cash portion of the unpaid seller's equity in the amount of the total amount still owing. Terms of the cash portion are, and here's where you would put in whether it's all to stay until the title transfers. You would write that in. Again, if that's the term that's staying, or if there are any payments to be made, you would list all of those. And you would also list any bonus that's to be paid out over and above the unpaid seller's equity that is to be paid at title transfer. So all of that gets listed here. And we'll go over a filled in example of that property that I mentioned. And you'll notice there are no additional terms. It just reiterates that the original agreement for sale, all of the terms in that still apply. Now here's the filled in example. And this is actually from the renewal agreement for that particular property. So the balance owing, including mortgage, was $306,342.87. And the details of the unpaid seller's equity are a term of 2 years to mature approximately September 14th, 2019. Now this we put in here because that is what the seller and I agreed on would be their maximum renewal at this time, because we had already done a first renewal. This was actually a second renewal, so it had to be by mutual agreement. The seller will provide the buyer a copy of the lender's renewal offer, and all that's the same. the cash portion of the seller's unpaid equity in the amount of $100,670.33. See, they left a lot in there. We got some huge mortgage pay down because of it. Terms of the cash portion are $20,000 payable on or before December 14th, 2017, $10,000 payable on or before each of June 14th, 2018, December 14th, 2018, and June 14th, 2019. If you recall, this was the deal where they had all that equity in the property. They didn't need it right away. But by the time this renewal came around, the husband was going back to school to get another designation. And so they wanted to be able to pay cash for those expenses for the tuition, as well as to make up for the fact that he wouldn't be working full time for the next year or so. So they really needed some of their equity, but not all. So that was good. We had those payments that we had to pay out, and we were still getting the same rate of principal pay down on the mortgage because that didn't come out of the mortgage. We weren't refinancing. Unfortunately, it came out of our pockets, but we were getting such good pay down that it didn't matter. We were able to do it. And of course, having a bunch of agreement for sale properties and also rent to owns in our portfolio, we're able to fund this. Additional terms. The buyer will pay the seller an additional $5,000 over and above unpaid seller's equity. And it should have said at time of title transfer, but that's okay. This is the bonus that we had offered to pay them because they did a second renewal, which they weren't required to do, and they still left a huge portion of their equity in the property. Subsequent renewals will be made by mutual agreement. The cash portion of the unpaid seller's equity must be paid in full for renewal past September 14th, 2019 to be considered. This term was in there because they wanted to put a deadline on when they would get paid the rest of their money. And we still wanted the opportunity to be able to keep the seller financing and existing underlying mortgage in place just in case we weren't able to refinance. Because at this time of this renewal, the market was still pretty flat. And in order for us to refinance at this time and cash them out and still maintain 20% equity in the property to keep it a conventional mortgage, we would have had to be thousands and thousands and thousands out of pocket all at once. And we didn't have the money at that time to do all of that at once. So us being able to renew for 2 years and letting that huge mortgage pay down happen, and then also paying little installments towards their unpaid seller's equity, gave us time to be able, and of course the market also picked up by the time this agreement for sale came due. And at that time, after this renewal, we were able to refinance. And not only could we leave the 20% in the property and cash out the seller's remaining cash portion of his equity, but also we were able to pull out $28,000 of the money we had put into the property back out again. So it all worked out great. But this was important to them that we were committing to pay out their equity, or else they would not consider any renewal. And that was pretty fair. And in the case of subsequent renewal and full payment of the cash portion of the unpaid equity, the seller will grant power of attorney for the buyer and or agent and will sign a transfer of land to be kept in trust with the buyer's or seller's attorney. So that's also very important, because if we were paying out all of their equity, now because they had such huge equity in the property, we didn't require a transfer of land to be done. And we also had a limited power of attorney in this case, because this is before I had the super contracts. So we didn't have all of the wonderful controls that these contracts now grant you. If we were to renew, pay out all their equity and renew, we would have needed that control, because remember, as soon as a seller has little to no equity in a property, they could become hard to find. So we wanted to have executed transfer of land on hand And then that way they could just be done with it, wash their hands of it, and still we could continue with the renewal if we needed to, but we didn't. The big thing is, as long as you're still creating those win-win situations where it's still working for your seller, then pretty much anything can be negotiated. Now, other management issues will depend on the type of hold of the property and exit strategy that you have. And again, those are regular rental to later refinance or sell, fix and flip, fix and refinance, then rent or rent to own. And when you would do that would be if you have a situation like the seller I mentioned before who had 123,000 in equity in the property that he may need if they ended up moving overseas, then he would need it to buy a house over there. He didn't know if and when he would need it, but he needed that flexibility, and therefore he could not commit to a long-term seller financing situation, but he could go with seller financing while we did the renovation of adding the legal suite to the basement. So this is when we would do the fix and then refinance and then add it to our regular rental portfolio. You can also sell immediately. You can assign the contract, or you can do a straight out rent to own without a fix and refinance. Intention is very important with your properties, what you intend to do with them, either holding them or flipping them. It matters for income tax purposes because if it's a flip, it's active income and there is no capital gains. If it's a hold, then it's passive income and any gains from the sale of the property are capital gains and it's all taxed differently. So it is important that we decide from the outset which one it will be. If you intend to rent and refinance or fix, refinance, and rent, your intention is long-term. You're adding it to your long-term rental portfolio. Therefore, it's not a flip and there's no active income, it's passive income. Now, if you intend to fix and flip, fix and refinance, and rent to own to sell right away or rent to own right away, then your intention is short-term and it's a flip and active income. Now, we still call it a flip, even though it's a potentially 3-year rent to own, because in real estate terms, 3 years as an intended hold is short. So if your intention is to let go of the property, sell it within a relatively short time period as far as real estate goes, then it's basically a flip. And that is active income, and all proceeds are taxed as active income. And you must decide at the outset whether it's the flip or the hold, because they are also considered differently in your chart of accounts. When your bookkeeper is doing your bookkeeping, they will either put the property as inventory, which of course turns over all the time, that's your flip, or as a long-term asset. Those are your regular rental properties. Now, things can change, and that's okay. The CRA or IRS or whatever your tax bureau is, they do understand that sometimes you intend for one thing to happen and it turns out something else happens. So you may have inadvertently misclassified it, but it's the intention that matters. So as long as you're staying true to your intentions and then they changed, that's okay. And be sure you have a tax accountant familiar with these strategies and consult with them. So that applies when you're buying the property and deciding what you're doing with it and how to classify it for your books, so that your bookkeeper can get started the right way and later your accountant can take it over. So it's a good idea when you're first getting started to consult with your accountant. And also consider and discuss incorporation if you're doing mainly active income. Now, if all of the properties that you're buying on agreement for sale are intended to be kept in your regular rental portfolio and eventually refinanced and held, then it's all passive income. There is most likely no need to incorporate. But if you do plan on doing a lot of fix and flips or rent to owns, then that's a lot of active income. And in Canada, active income is taxed in small business at a preferential rate, so you do want to consider incorporation. And with incorporation, of course, you're going to consult the professionals, your tax accountant and your incorporation lawyer, ideally one familiar with real estate and holding companies. The reason I mention this is because you may want to consider multiple levels of incorporation. In our case, we have a holding company that owns our operational company, which owns all the properties. This way, we can declare a dividend from the operational company up to the holding company and basically transfer the value of the operational company up. And that gives an extra layer of protection. We're getting a little bit complicated and technical here, but I feel it's important to outline all the possibilities, and then you can consult with your professionals and decide. And of course, asset protection is key, and that's what that second level of incorporation does. Now, you never should DIY the incorporation process. I don't care how good those DIY kits get. There is no substitute for professional advice, especially when it comes to a more complicated business like real estate with creative strategies where there are different potential tax treatments. So yeah, DIY is just not going to work. If you were an oil change business and you're setting up shop to change oil, that's simple. That is one way to tax it, one way to incorporate it, you're good to go. But that's not the case here where there are potentially multiple tax treatments. And if you do incorporate, let your lawyer keep your minute books and your corporate seal and file your annual returns and do all of that. It only costs, I think, $300 and some a year for each corporation for the lawyer to keep all of that for us and file the annual reports. And then I don't have to think about it. That's the way I like it. Now on to the hold and exit strategies. First, regular rental. Considerations for an agreement for sale regular rental are cash flow, first of all. So when you look at your for sale by owner script and you run your numbers, is it going to cash flow as a regular rental? Because of course, regular rentals are usually lower cash flow, lower total monthly payment received than rent to own. And will there be enough free equity when the time comes to make the refinance easy? So if there's $50,000 in free equity, which is definitely not unheard of, that makes it a whole lot easier to refinance a few years down the road, because that $50,000 in free equity coupled with the mortgage pay down over the 3 years, you could potentially have your 20% of equity in the property, the required down payment for conventional mortgage, when you refinance, and you might not need to put any money into the property, which is fantastic. And is there going to be a decent mortgage paydown? Now, remember, as far as cash flow goes, I prefer positive cash flow. I like money coming into my bank every month, not going out. But if that negative cash flow is caused by accelerated mortgage paydown, that's not so bad. So if your mortgage paydown is really high, that's also going to make it easier to refinance later. So that's another consideration, and it all goes hand in hand. And is there going to be enough time for the value to climb? If it's a flat market, or if it's a not so plain vanilla property, then it will take longer for that value to climb. And remember, the mortgage paydown is guaranteed. The free equity is a bonus. Any value increases, that's an extra special bonus, and we definitely cannot guarantee that. And what's the length of renewal possible? If there's not enough time for the value to increase, the mortgage to pay down, and free equity all making that refinance easy, are we going to be able to renew for long enough to make it work as a regular rental? And of course, being a regular rental, you would be responsible as the landlord for repairs and maintenance, so you will need to make sure you have a reserve fund for that. It doesn't need to be paid all up front, but you should be budgeting every month for it. Fix and flip. Considerations here are, first of all, the state of the market. Of course, if the market is rising, it is often a good time to do a fix and flip. But with agreement for sale, it can also work in a fairly flat market because we're avoiding expensive bridge financing. For anyone who doesn't know, with bridge financing, that is the term usually used for financing for big renovations when you purchase. It's a temporary mortgage is what it's intended to be. And you pay extra for that. So there's usually a big application fee, which can be 3% of your total mortgage value. And you're usually paying much higher interest than a regular bank mortgage because they need to make all of their money in a very short time to make it worth their while. So bridge financing is temporary financing specifically for renovations usually, and it is expensive. But if we're buying with agreement for sale and we're just walking into the regular ordinary interest bank mortgage, then we're saving thousands and thousands and thousands in costs that would go to the high application fee and the holding costs being higher because of higher interest rates. So a flip can work better with agreement for sale than standard financing, bridge financing. So you can sometimes make it work even in a flat market. Other considerations for fix and flips are your renovation contractors in-house, or are you paying full retail? So if you are regularly doing flips and you accumulate a team of renovators, then your renovations are probably going to be a whole lot cheaper than if you're having to hire a general contractor with his team and pay full retail. So if you're going to do a lot of flips, you definitely want to consider getting an in-house team. You'll be able to have a bigger spread, more profit, and do more projects. DIY. This is another place where it's often not worth doing, not because a DIYer can't do a good job, but because of the opportunity cost. If you are in there laying tile at your renovation, you are not out finding your next deal, which could be worth a whole lot more than the money you save on tiling. So although you may love doing renovations, you may want to consider hiring it out so that you don't have that opportunity cost of missing the deals. And if you love them to the point that you really, really want to do them, just remember it's more like a hobby that makes you money rather than a business. The source and cost of your renovation funds is another consideration. It's possible you might have the money sitting in the bank because you probably paid little to no money down on the property, buying it on agreement for sale. But if it's a bigger renovation and you don't have that money, where are you going to get it? So it could be from private lending, or it could be from a joint venture partner. Now, with a joint venture partner, you could be joint venturing with a renovation partner or just with a money partner and then hiring out the renovations. If you joint venture with a renovation partner who will be doing the renovations for you, I would caution that you still use licensed contractors rather than DIYers because, and I speak from experience, a DIY renovation crew may not have the skill set to the high standard that they think they do. So at the very least, you need to visit a few of the projects they've done, do your due diligence, check their references at the very least. But as I say, if I was to do it all over again, I would still only joint venture with a renovation partner that had a proper licensed team in place. And vacancy, of course, is a consideration in any flip because normally the property is going to be vacant while you do those renovations. And the fix always takes longer than you thought it would. Now, to fix, refinance, and rent, your considerations there, again, are going to be cash flow because now you're going to do the fix, you're going to refinance on the higher value. That's going to make your mortgage payments bigger, most likely. And will this fix create enough equity? Because you would want to have enough equity to pay out your seller if they had a cash portion of equity. You would want the 20% down payment to be still able to be left in the property, and potentially to pay off renovations. So you need to consider how much of a spread you've got to start with, how much of the money you're going to be able to pull out in that refinance, and what it's going to pay for, and what you still might need to cover. You may be doing a fixed refinance rent and then bring in a joint venture partner to put the money back in your bank account so you can do more projects. And with a refinance and rent, of course, time heals all wounds in real estate. So if you do have a few minor issues and maybe it doesn't cash flow as much as you want, maybe the renovation went way over budget or over time will heal those wounds. You just have to sit back and wait because, again, you've already refinanced it, so you're in a good position. And of course, you need a reserve fund for repairs because it's a regular rental. With fixed refinance and rent to own, your cash flow is going to be better because with rent to own, you're usually charging a premium rent and you're either getting money up front for the option payment or money every month for option payments, or potentially both. Again, are you creating enough equity to pay your seller, cover your 20% down, and pay your renovations? Is the market direction rent to own friendly? You will find that in a flat market, there is not a lot of consumer confidence, either in the economy or in the real estate market. So you won't find a lot of people interested in being rent-to-own tenants. It's better to have a rising market, or at least those green shoots of the economy and the real estate market starting. As soon as that starts, interest in rent-to-own picks up. But if there aren't green shoots or sparks in the economy and the real estate market, if things aren't getting started yet, you will have trouble finding a rent-to-own tenant. Vacancy is going to be longer with rent-to-own. For the fix and refinance and rent, I didn't put vacancy as a consideration because it's usually pretty easy to find a rental tenant on a freshly renovated property. That happens pretty fast. But with rent to own, first of all, you need to find somebody who needs rent to own. Secondly, you need to find somebody who likes your house. So it does take longer to find a rent to own tenant. And because you're doing a rent to own and it's a short-term hold, time is not your friend. It's not a factor in helping to heal any wounds or mistakes. So if that renovation went way over budget, you may need to consider holding it for longer and not doing a rent to own so you have time then to heal those wounds. Selling immediately is an option, especially when there's huge free equity. In the one case where we had, I believe it was 53 or 56,000 in free equity, all options were available to us. We could sell it right away, even with a realtor, and still make money, or we could rent to own it, or we could have it as a regular rental. So we listed it for all three and just decided whatever good offer comes up first, that's what we'll take. Considerations here, yes, you could list it for all three: sale, rent, and rent to own. And that is what we did in that case with huge free equity. Because it wasn't a property that we wanted in our long-term portfolio, our preference was definitely to either sell or rent to own, but it still could have been a regular rental. It was a nice place. Staging. Because the market was fairly flat when we got this property, and that's why the people were willing to give up the 50-some thousand in equity, because they could not afford to hold it long enough to wait for it to sell, because sales were sometimes taking 2, 3, 4 months. So they couldn't wait that long. They needed to sell it. That's why they walked away from the equity and why we got it. And that is also why I did hire professional stagers to set us apart from all of the competition, because I wanted it to sell or rent to own right away. I also didn't want to wait 4 months. And realtors' fees are a consideration if you are listing with a regular realtor. And often you do want to do that if you're trying to sell a property in a flatter market. It's probably a good idea to list it with a realtor, but you can also either list it on the MLS through a for sale by owner type site, or if you have a friend who's a licensed realtor but not active, they may be able to do it for you. One caution, two things actually. You're going to still need to offer or want to offer the buyer's realtor's commissions, because you will sometimes get a for sale by owner buyer, but more often than not, people are going to be buying through a realtor because it costs them nothing to buy through a realtor, because it's your side, the seller side, that pays the commissions. So often your buyers will have realtors, so you usually will want to offer full buyer's realtor commission. But also you need to be careful with those for sale by owner sites, because sometimes the buyer's realtor will try to steer their buyer away from for sale by owner sites, because that realtor is thinking that he's going to need to do twice the work and only get still his one share of money for twice the amount of work. So it's possible they'll steer their clients away from for sale by owner type listings. So that is another reason why, if you're going to list on the MLS, you may want to consider listing with your favorite realtor. And of course, make sure it's a good realtor who is a good seller. The other reason why I say, is it viable on the FSBO MLS listing, is because there are a lot of buyers realtors out there who will try to take advantage of you as a FSBO seller. They will often assume that you are an uneducated, inexperienced seller and will try to pull the wool over your eyes. And I've had this happen multiple times, and it doesn't take me long to get that idea out of their heads. But if you are not a strong negotiator, or you are not a strong personality who doesn't mind conflict, then again, you may want to stick with a seller's realtor. Mortgage prepayment penalties will, of course, be a factor. And since one of the reasons that the sellers are coming to us is to avoid sellers' mortgage prepayment penalties, we will need to absorb those. So make sure you include that in your cost. And you can ask the seller to call up the bank and find out what that amount will be, and you'll know in advance. Vacancy, of course, is an issue when you're selling a property. Especially in this case, it was a worry because it was a flatter, slower market. So we weren't sure how well it would sell. But again, that's why we listed with a realtor and did the staging, and it ended up selling within 2 months. Possession was within 2 months. It sold within 1 month. And so possession was turned over 2 months after we got possession. So that was pretty cool. Assignment. Considerations with assignment, first of all, are the fees. Now, assignment fees vary. They can be as little as $2,000. They can be as high as $25,000 or more. It really depends on the deal. If you are getting, for instance, a deal with fix and flip potential or fix and refinance potential that has a huge spread between current value and after repaired value, I mean, it could easily be $100,000, $150,000, even $200,000 for some of these deals that need a lot of work. And if there's a $200,000 spread and it's only going to cost the renovator $80,000 to fix, well, that's $120,000 in profit. There's room in there for you to potentially get a $25,000 assignment fee. So negotiate the best deal you can, because the bigger the spread, the bigger the potential assignment fee. And we have that disposition clause right in our purchase agreement, so the seller is aware of the possibilities of what we could be doing with the property. And if we turn around and make $25,000 for selling it to somebody else, they really don't have much to say to it because they knew that that was a possibility. And as usual, my opinion is that you should never sign a purchase contract on a property that you are not willing and able to close on yourself, because if you are signing that purchase contract, can't find a new buyer to assign it to, and then you're canceling that contract, that could really be messing with your seller. So I personally highly discourage that. Rent to own, my favorite. So considerations for rent to own: is the market ripe for rent to own? As we discussed, you want to have that positive feeling, that vibe in your economy, consumer confidence in both the economy and the real estate market. And that also helps to determine whether a price increase is possible. Now, when you're buying on agreement for sale and selling with rent to own, it's okay if it's a flat market. You're still going to make enough money to make it worthwhile because you're paying little to no money down. You're getting that mortgage paid down. Even if you sell it for exactly what you pay for it, you're going to do just fine. But is that price increase possible? If the market is rising, then that is always a good thing to be able to increase your final price. And you usually want your rent to own term to match the agreement for sale term, but it's not often going to work, because even if you have a 3-year mortgage and a 3-year rent agreement for sale, and you find a tenant who probably needs 3 years for a rent to own, it could be that they're not quite ready to buy at the 3 years and you need a short renewal, or it could be they are unexpectedly ready at 2 years and now you're going to need to sell early and face mortgage prepayment penalties. But that's okay, because with rent to own, you're usually making more than selling any other way. So we're okay with that. This is why it's my favorite. Vacancy, as mentioned before, is a bigger concern with rent to own. And in this case, you're not doing the fix first. So your vacancy is probably going to be longer. So with a fix in rent to own, it might only be 2 months of a vacancy before you find the right person. With a just as is condition rent to own, it could be longer. It could easily be 4 months. And renewal, of course, is going to be a consideration. It's usually not a problem though, because when we have a rent to own tenant in place with a signed option agreement and they're just not quite ready to buy yet, it's usually pretty easy to speak to your seller and say, they're almost ready to buy, they just need a few more months. So we do need a short renewal in order for them to be able to proceed. And variable versus open for your mortgage. This is a funny story. So we had a rent-to-own tenant and the term came up and we did a regular renewal for the first rent-to-own term and mortgage and everything. And then when it came up again, they were almost ready to buy. So we left it as open because it was just going to be another month. Then that month came and they were almost ready. And then that next 2 months came and they were almost ready. Well, a year and a half later of open mortgage, and I decided, okay, I've had enough of the open mortgage. I'm just going to renew to variable and then they can take more time. But by that time, the plus variable prime plus minus had changed to the point that it really wasn't any difference if I stayed with open or variable. So yes, we suffered through a year and a half of open mortgage because the tenant buyer was almost ready. So my advice is seriously consider renewing to a variable mortgage if your buyer is almost ready. Now, an agreement for sale case study. This is an example of a real deal, a little bit simplified. The price we paid for the property was $270,000. The value of the property at that time was $300,000. The mortgage was $255,000, so very little equity to pay out at the end. We paid a purchase deposit of $5,000, which means that the unpaid seller's equity, including mortgage, was $265,000. So that's the price we paid less the $5,000. And of that, there was $255,000 in mortgage and $10,000 in cash balance of the cash portion of the unpaid seller's equity. Now, 3 years later, we sold for $324,000, which was a price increase up from what we paid for it of $54,000. So it was only a value increase of $24,000, but a price increase of $54,000. Our mortgage paydown during those 3 years totaled $23,560, and our profit from rent totaled $54,50, less $3,000 in legal fees for the purchase and sale, and that means we had a total net profit of $80,010. That's not too shabby. Now, let's look at our ROI. Return on investment, of course, is profit divided by capital over time, capital invested. So it was $80,010 in profit divided by $5,000 in capital over 3 years. That means a 533.4% return on an investment per year. That's insane. That is the power of agreement for sale. Now, if we were doing a rent to own exit on that to sell it in the 3 years, then we would have got an upfront payment from our rent to own tenants, and that is usually at least $10,000. Now, remember, we only paid $5,000 as a purchase deposit on the property. So that $10,000 would have reimbursed our $5,000 in down payment, plus it would have covered our holding costs for the couple of months while we found the rent-to-own tenant, meaning we would have had zero cash in the property, and our return on investment would be infinite. Phew. I can hear the minds exploding. Now, this, oh my goodness. You may remember me telling you about that I saw and I was so excited about, and it was a legally suited property listed for $359,900, and I didn't do the deal. Today we're going to discuss why. So here's the real deal. This is the ad, fully renovated with a legal 2-bedroom basement suite. It gave the basic details of the home, and then there are loads of upgrades: 2 furnaces, tankless water heater, electrical main floor kitchen, bath, flooring, paint, fixtures, shingles, and appliances. Basement is all new and never been lived in, plus all work complies with the city. Backyard is huge with a garden, patio, RV parking, and storage, oversized single garage. Awesome location, close to schools, playground, bus, and easy access to Yellowhead Trail, immediate possession available. If you may recall, they had been living in the main floor suite while the basement suite was being constructed. They had since already moved into their new home, so now the whole thing was vacant and ready to go. So I was really excited about this. The numbers, they were asking $359,900 on the MLS. Remember, that listing had now expired, and they had been trying to sell it at that price for the past 6 months. The mortgage balance was approximately $250,000. The payments were $1,350, including property tax. And as a legally suited house, the rent would likely be at least $2,300, at least. This was a 1960s house, and all of my 1960s legally suited houses rent for more than $2,300. So that's why I have $2,300 as a minimum. So that definitely covers your mortgage and taxes and insurance. The tax assessed value was $311,000. The honestdoor.com value was $335,000. So that was already a fairly fair price. His lowest possible price that he had mentioned was $340,000. And that seemed pretty decent. I didn't feel the need to get comparables from my realtor, and legally suited houses at that time were selling for more. So yeah, this seemed like a pretty sweet deal. But this is the first time I've ever been to a property where I didn't know immediately what to do about it, where I actually had to go back and think about it and make a pro-con list. I could not decide what to do. So normally what I would say if I saw a house that had a few issues, I would say something like, well, from what I've seen of the house, it's going to take an additional $30,000 to bring it up to today's standards or to fix these issues or whatever the case may be. So the most we'd be willing to pay is $310,000, for example. Now, I couldn't even say that. I really didn't know what to do. So we're going to play a game. Now, we're going to go through the photos that were on the MLS listing, and we're going to pretend we're doing the walkthrough that is at the property when we're meeting to close the deal. So we're having our imaginary walkthrough, and I'd like you to make a quick list of the issues you see and consider what you're going to do with this property. How would you handle it? And forewarning, this is going to be part of your homework. So make your list, check it twice, write down some values of what you think needs to be changed and what you would potentially do with the property. So what's wrong with this picture? Now, it is in a decent area. It's a little bit close to a main thoroughfare here in Edmonton, but it was across from a school, so good location. The outside looks plain and ordinary, not really any issue with it. The siding had been upgraded, so that's all fine. But the first thing when I walk in the door, you may have already noticed, is the very old-fashioned divider. These dividers came out with houses in the 60s, and they are so outdated. It just makes no sense that you would replace the flooring, do all the painting, and not get rid of this. Now, in this picture, you can see that it has a bookcase attached to it, which is accessible from the living room. Now, what we've done with this particular feature, we got rid of this glass top that looked so dated, and then we painted the bookcase to match the trim, or you can match the walls. But then it looked great. It still functioned as a room divider, great to have a bookcase built in, but it didn't look dated. Now, in the dining room, not really much you can see. Oh, you may want to zoom out to full screen to be able to see these pictures a little bit better, because when it's the small version, it's harder to see the issues. So in this case, and I could tell from the pictures that there was something that looked a little off about the flooring, something that looked a little rough, but I couldn't tell what it was until I got there. And all of these little gaps, little white marks that you see, that's caulking. So they did the floor, but they cut a whole lot of the floorboards too short. And instead of recutting them, they just filled the gaps with caulking. So it looked terrible. Now here's another picture of the dining room. And here you can see that the flooring in the kitchen and the dining room are different. They look decent together, but it's obviously different. And so it's a kind of a harsh transition. So I didn't really care for that. Give you a second to take in the kitchen. And you will notice that, yes, this wainscoting, so to speak, is in fact vinyl plank. It looks okay. In person, it doesn't look as nice, but it would definitely keep chair scuffs off the wall. So I guess that's all right. I also didn't like that the stove was right next to the window and drapes and everything. Now in this picture, the difference between the flooring is even more obvious. And you will see very cheap lighting. A hint to anyone who is doing renovations, don't cheap out on the lighting. You can find inexpensive lighting that doesn't look cheap. This looks cheap. It's a poor choice. And in this picture, it is hard to tell, perhaps easier if you are zoomed in, but this is common area because the laundry is downstairs. And this here is Barker board from the 1960s, and it is slightly pink. So Barker board is a product that is kind of nice because it's very durable and water resistant. So it's often used as backsplashes, that sort of thing, but it makes the common area here look very dated. Now into the bathroom in the main floor suite. It's not easy to tell in this picture, but more obvious in this picture. There is a beige door on a white vanity. And here's the other beige door. It's in fact a different color of beige. You also can't see it, but the vanity countertop is pretty chipped up. And this here, perhaps no one has ever seen one of these before, but this is a handheld bidet sprayer. So instead of having a standalone bidet appliance or a bidet seat, this is a little sprayer that is attached to the water line of the toilet, so you can adjust yourself and give a little wash. So that would need to go. And now we're headed downstairs. The pink Barker board, pinkish Barker board is more obvious. Now we're in the kitchen downstairs. In the photo, it looks all right. I am not a fan of the kitchen so suddenly ending with the tile very sharply outlining the kitchen, but some people do like that. Now, one thing that you can potentially see as a problem is this microwave. I'm above average height. My microwave sits even with my cabinets. A lot of people have theirs sitting lower than their cabinets. This one is at least 6 inches above the base of the cabinets. And again, above average height. For me to reach into that microwave, I had to stand on my tiptoes. So that would not be safe, especially considering it's over a stove. So that would have to change. It would have to be moved. There are a couple other things you can't see that we'll cover later. Now we're into the living room. The window is a little bit small. They didn't make it egress, but that's fine because it's the living room. But they also installed a lot of lighting, so it is nice and bright. That's good. Now here's the bedroom. Now remember, this is all new construction, so they could have done whatever they wanted. And why they stopped the closet here and left this 14-inch space to collect dust, I will never know. If it was me, I would have made the closet all the way across, and that would have been better for everybody. And here is the bathroom. And in this picture, there's nothing wrong with the bathroom, but we'll come back to that. And this is the shared laundry room. One thing you can't see is that they put underlay, hard foam underlay under the planks, which I think should have actually been under a subfloor because it did make the floor a bit squishy. So I'm thinking that that flooring would probably last at most 3 years. Now here's outside. That all looks great. Lots of room to park and some storage room that is on the side of the garage. That's important because anytime you have a suited house, storage is potentially an issue. So all of that looked good. And maintenance-free fence for most of it. So that also looked good. Now, here's the reality. This is the photo I took of the bathroom rather than the MLS photo. And as you can see, the toilet is over a foot from the wall. The seller claimed that he had instructed the contractor to move the toilet to be against the wall. Of course, that would involve redoing the plumbing, jackhammering the floor, and all of that. And apparently, the contractor decided it was too much work, and the homeowner was not supervising enough. And it got left like this. Now, the problem here is this is all new flooring, and this still needs to be fixed because it's really close to the vanity. There's not much room, and it blocks half the tub. Between the toilet and the vanity, most of the access to your tub is blocked. So it really does need to be moved. Now we're paying for a brand new tile floor that we're going to have to rip up and redo. So that was interesting. And that was something that made me think, if I don't fix it, how is it going to attract renters? I mean, sure, you could put a shelving unit behind there, but it's still going to look off, and the access to the tub being blocked like that. I mean, if you had a single parent and a small child in there, how the heck are they going to bathe their kids? So it's very awkward, and I didn't see how it could stay like that. Now, here's the summary of issues that I found. So now you can add to your list if you missed any of these. So upstairs, we had some of the items being quite dated, like the entry shelf. The living room window was also very old style with the mesh in it, metal mesh. Many of the windows were original upstairs. The patchwork renovations, like the flooring not matching, caulking to fix the flooring mistakes, that drove me wild. Also upstairs, the bidet sprayer would have to be removed and the plumbing fixed. Mismatched vanity doors. The countertop was very chipped in there. And that old Barker board in the stairwell looked incredibly dated. Downstairs, we had the microwave so high that it is unsafe. The toilet in the middle of the bathroom. So those were two major issues for me. That closet ending with that 1 foot unusable gap. And what you can't see in the pictures, but you discover when you're there, the tiles, although they were lined up very well, obviously someone had used the spacers, they were pressed down too much in a lot of places, and some were very proud. And there was one in particular that I know if I lived there, I'd break my toe. So that was not good. The kitchen cabinets looked cheap. In fact, they looked so cheap, I asked the seller if he got them used. They were really rough. There were screw holes where there shouldn't be screw holes. There were screw holes that were almost poking through the cabinets. They were terrible, to the point where I would almost want to replace them again. And yeah, chips, screws almost through, misplaced drill holes for the hardware. It was such a terrible install. I couldn't believe they were new. The countertop end caps were very poorly installed, to the point it would be a health code violation. The LVT was spongy in places, as I mentioned. It had the hard foam underlay, which I think needed a subfloor, and it had been slightly separated where a wall was moved and the floor wasn't leveled. With LVT, you have to have a very level floor or it's going to flex and break. Now, what else can't we see? So we've got all of these problems that we can see just with our naked eyes, and that makes me think in every property. And by the way, I do a walkthrough like this in every property I see, because I'm making that to-do list of things that I have to get done before I rent or sell or rent to own. So this is really important. And anytime that I see problems like that terrible toilet install and the terrible cabinet install and the terrible ceramic tile install and everything else, then you really have to consider all of the things that you can't see that are done and covered when the renovation is finished. So subfloor under those ceramic tiles is a perfect example. Without a proper subfloor, then tiles will lift and grout will break, and it is a mess. Was there waterproof backing used in the behind the shower surround? That's a brand new install, or was it just regular plain old drywall that is going to mold? There could be other plumbing issues and ventilation issues in the plumbing because that toilet was done in the laziest way possible. It made me instantly question how the plumbing in the newly installed basement kitchen would be. Soundproofing between the suites, brand new ceiling. Is there anything in there? Soundproofing between legal suites is very important if you want to keep tenants and keep them happy. So what would you do? Would you walk away from this property? Would you give a lowball offer? And if so, how much of a lowball offer would you give? And what would you say to try to get that lowball offer accepted? Would you assign the contract? Now, keep in mind, I don't want anyone assigning contracts that they're not willing to close on yourself. So that's a tricky question. Or would you refer to a realtor and hope that the realtor could sell it? And now here's an important point. Remember how I mentioned before about make sure you have a good realtor. And I've also said before how some realtors will overinflate what they think the asking price will be. They'll tell you a higher asking price, just hoping to get the listing. I believe that is what happened to this poor seller, because I found out from my realtor that the original asking price on this property was $399, which is what legally suited, well done properties were going for. But this realtor's thinking that this property was worth $399. That was a little bit of a flight of fancy, if you ask me. And it didn't sell at $359.9. So obviously $399 was out to lunch. So getting that good realtor who knows how to price assertively to get that sale, that is important, especially when we are referring people to use our realtors. Or should we suggest that he rent it out? And that could be the best solution because it is legally suited, it is brand new. Maybe people won't stay long because of the issues, but he could wait it out and potentially pay down the mortgage and have the value just increase with time, and then having to sell it for less at that point won't be as big of an issue. So what would you do? So your homework is email your idea with what you would do with that property, and also make 5 for sale by owner calls and send me your sheets. And of course, watch the email for your Zoom link. In the portal, you will find the replay and slides, you'll find the transcript, of course, and you'll find the renewal agreement as well as that example with the bonuses and extra payments filled in. And next week, we are covering joint venture partners because, as we've heard from today, sometimes you do need them, and pitfalls and protections. So that's it for this week. Thank you for joining me, and we will see you next week for Module 5 of the Agreement for Sale Cash Cow Formula.